Okay, so welcome back everyone to the VOX-Pol guest lecture series. My guest today is Dr. Anthony Richards, who is a senior lecturer in criminology and co-director of the MSc in Terrorism and Counterterrorism Studies at Royal Holloway, where he's also the school director in postgraduate education. He's the author and lead editor for Jihadist Terror, New Threats, New Responses, and the author of Conceptualizing Terrorism, which was published with the OUP in 2015. He's also published on a wide variety of other terrorist-related themes, including radicalization, extremism, UK counterterrorism, British public and Muslim attitudes towards terrorism, counterterrorism, homeland security, and so on. And without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Anthony. He's going to be talking today about conceptualizing terrorism and indeed the need to conceptualize terrorism. Take it away, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Sean. And can I say, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to contribute here today about this very contentious issue of conceptualizing terrorism. What I guess I plan to do today is perhaps look at some of the reasons why it has been seen as desirable to try and generate a universally agreed definition of terrorism, and then perhaps move on to some of the real challenges in trying to do that. And also perhaps try to demonstrate that there are implications of this. You know, when you're using terms like terrorism and indeed radicalization, which I'll talk a bit about later on, you know, words do matter. There are implications in the real world in relation to how these concepts are defined. So first up, defining terrorism or conceptualizing terrorism, there is a difference, which I see there to be a slight difference of two, which I'll come on to. But why is there this need for an agreed definition of terrorism? I remember at a Madrid conference many years ago now, actually in 2005, one of the conclusions would seem to be that terrorism is a product of its own time and place, hence the inherent difficulty in trying to generate common approaches and common understandings of the phenomenon of terrorism. Now, is it worth the effort? I think you posed that, Sean. Should we be trying to generate an agreement terrorism? Should we be trying to get a universal understanding of what terrorism is? Is it worth that effort? Well, you can see here Walter Lacour, who's a well-known authority within terrorism studies, and he's skeptical that we should spend too much effort on trying to define or conceptualize terrorism. But Edward Said, of course, himself says that it's usually unfocused, it's highly selective, and this really speaks to the subjective application of the concept of terrorism, which I'll come on to shortly. Well, now what are the sort of reasons that have been put out there for trying to generate a universally agreed definition of terrorism? Now, there are many, many definitions out there, but the challenge is trying to get an agreed definition. And I suppose one of the key sort of theories behind this is that terrorism has become arguably more international than it has ever been. Faced with a predominant terrorist threat that is international. The theory then goes on to say that, well, if it is so international, then surely we must have international cooperation against this cross-border phenomenon. And in order to generate international cooperation, surely we need to agree what it is that we're countering. So this has been one of the sort of the main thrusts, if you like, behind this need to generate universal agreement on the definition of terrorism, to try and get some agreement on it. And that to form the basis of a counter-terrorism strategy. I mean, there are obviously other reasons as to why you'd want to generate a definition of terrorism, and that is to prevent the use of the word terrorism by some states in order to impose and implement draconian legislation and draconian responses to what perhaps many of us in perhaps some Western states, if you like, see as legitimate protests. So this idea that the term terrorism and therefore counterterrorism, inverted commas, can be used for ulterior motives. There's also quite a powerful academic reason for trying to generate an agreed definition of terrorism, because it might help determine the parameters of terrorism research. It's a starting point, if you like, of terrorism research. If we're to look at other theories related to terrorism, like the causes of terrorism, then presumably you need to find out what we mean by terrorism in the first place, why people disengage from terrorism, counterterrorism theories. Presumably, with all these kind of different research endeavors within terrorism, it's contingent on what one means by terrorism in the first place. Similarly, if you're carrying out research, perhaps PhD research, and you're looking at particular case studies, what is it that's terrorist about the violence within the case study they're looking at compared with other forms of violence? So I guess that's to tease out what is terrorism within the particular cases of the research that you're looking at. And of course, when you're looking at or trying to compile databases and chronologies of terrorism, once again, the key challenge and the fundamental factor in all of that, of course, is to determine what you mean by terrorism in the first place. What counts as terrorism and what? So these are sort of fairly powerful reasons for trying to generate a universally agreed definition of terrorism. A social structure. That means it can never be a concrete truth as to what terrorism is. Indeed, like all social science concepts, they are socially constructed. So they are not brute facts. They're not hard facts. They're not truths, as it were. A second option might be to try and conceptualize terrorism. In other words, rather than trying to speak truth on the concept, perhaps it's possible at a given time and a given place where people can agree what conceptualizing terrorism might look like, or a conception of terrorism might look like, even if we concede that it's not a hard fact, but a socially constructed understanding of terrorism. And perhaps thirdly, without really thinking about trying to construct a definition or even a conceptualization of terrorism, what is it? What is it, nevertheless, that we think is analytically distinctive about terrorism? If indeed it is. If indeed it is. Of course, there's a theory that actually terrorism is simply a label to use against adversaries, when in actual fact, perhaps the type of violence that we see within terrorism may not be qualitatively that different to other forms of political violence. So the idea that actually terrorism just becomes, as Conor Gearty once said, a useful insult for adversary. So there are different sort of levels of analytical endeavor that you could perhaps go for. The ultimate one of the last 50 years has been, if you look at the academic literature and indeed within policymaking, the ultimate endeavor has been to try and define, although, as I said, it is a social construction. It can never be a truth about what terrorism means. Moving on to the challenges in terms of trying to construct some understanding as to what terrorism means. Well, is this problem of subjectivity, the way that terrorism has been applied subjectively. It's seen as a pejorative term, and you'll see in the literature on terrorism that actually it's seen as a negative, a derogatory label. And there goes hand in hand, and I'm sure you've all heard of this idea that one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. Now, I don't really go along with this idea of one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter, but I'll come on to discuss that and see perhaps how we can transcend that dilemma shortly. And related to that is whether actually what we see, for example, within the Middle East, are we looking for struggles for national liberation, or is it terrorism? And I'll come on to how we might address shortly. The second major challenge, I think, beyond the subjective application of the word terrorism, I think, is what components would you include in your conceptualization or your definition of terrorism? And as you'll see from the research, a number of components have been included in that. The use of violence or the threat of violence. Well, I'd say at the outset of this slide, when you look at these concepts, they are all themselves contested concepts. The use of violence and the threat of violence. Now, even that, although it's seen as the most common component within definitions and conceptualization of terrorism, even that is contested by some, in the sense that some, Tim Shanahan, for example, I think, thinks, well, perhaps we should consider using harm instead of violence. Because there's some debate about what violence actually means. If you look at the Oxford Dictionary, for example, violence means physical force. Does that mean, if you exclude poisonings, for example, from your understanding of what violence is, does that mean that anthrax letters, for example, that some years ago that were sent in America, for example, does that mean that they are not acts of terrorism because they don't satisfy our definition of violence? Hence, this idea that maybe we should look at harm and the threat of harm rather than violence. So there's a debate around that. Now, perhaps against that is this idea that, well, you know, how serious does harm need to be included in the definition of terrorism? Maybe there are all sorts of harms there that wouldn't meet that threshold of seriousness. There's a debate around that. Political. Bruce Hoffman once said that terrorism is ineluctably political. But of course, as you will see from the literature, people see that terrorism can be religiously motivated. Some even might suggest it's economically motivated too. But I would probably suggest that whether there are religious dimensions, economic dimensions, ultimately there are political dimensions in terms of the motivation for terrorism. So I would tend to go along with the view that terrorism, in one way or another, is politically motivated. Certainly, I see it as a form of violent communication. This idea that terrorism is intended to generate a message beyond the immediate victims to target audiences. And another key debate, I guess, is the extent that terrorism or definitions of terrorism should include civilian targeting. Interestingly enough, a survey carried out by Schmidt and all the definitions he included in one of his publications, something like 250 odd definitions, most of them didn't actually explicitly say that civilians had to be the targets in their conceptions or definitions of terrorism. There are all sorts of debates around this, of course. Well, if we're including civilians, what about non-combatants? In other words, those who are outside conflict zones. They may be military, but they're outside conflict zone. They're in non-combatant mode. Surely they can also be victims of terrorism. Or you could argue, as indeed I do in some of my work, that anybody could actually become a victim of terrorism. But this is another debate, the extent that we should be including civilian targeting as part of our understanding of terrorism. There are other considerations too. Damage to property. Should that be seen as a possible part of terrorism in our conceptions or understanding of terrorism? And I suppose if you stick to this idea that terrorism is about generating psychological impact beyond the immediate victims, I suppose if damage to property, if it's able to do that, perhaps it would come within that conceptual space of terrorism. And then there's this notion about whether terrorism, it needs to be more than a single act to be regarded as terrorism. And again, perhaps looking at some of the perhaps slightly older literature, perhaps there's this view that actually to be called terrorism needs part of a campaign. And the theory behind that is that terrorism is about generating fear. And if it is viewed that there's just going to be a single act, then that doesn't really do the job of perpetuating fear. Whereas a campaign and the idea of imminent acts of violence would do. Another debate that has been in terrorism studies, is it an individual phenomenon or is it an organizational phenomenon? I think perhaps 20, 25 years ago, authors would generally see it as an organizational phenomenon. They would choose the recruits, they would choose the timing of an attack, they would choose the location of the attack, and so on. Things may have changed since then. We've seen, I think, in the last 15 to 20 years, the decentralization of the nature of the terrorist threat. And perhaps, although they have appeared before, as we know, but perhaps a greater prevalence of so-called lone actor terrorism, and perhaps the individual has come more into play in terms of our understanding of terrorism. So this is, there's no right or wrongs about this, but certainly one of the big challenges when you're trying to generate your conceptualization of terrorism, and I repeat, there is no right or wrong about this, and one of those challenges is trying to determine what components you would include in that conceptualization. State and terrorism, another debate as to the extent that the state is culpable for terrorism, the extent that state should be included, or at least not excluded, in our deliberations as to what terrorism means. And indeed, states, not just state terrorism, what you might call state terrorism, but state-sponsored terrorism too. And if you look at some of the definitions, state definitions of terrorism, you often see the words illegitimate, unlawful, or illegal in those definitions. And I think, the idea here perhaps is to, really point out that this kind of excludes state culpability. How could the state be possible, be terrorism? So if you look at some of the critical terrorism studies literature, of course, they very much discuss this idea as a state as culpable for state terrorism. I probably prefer to use the word state terror as a more ubiquitous, if you like, coming from the top. And I think in some of the literature and terrorism studies, you'll see that actually, in terms of the acts of states, or the wide-scale terror, if you think of examples like Pol Pot, Stalin, Hitler, that maybe state terror is something as seen as coming from above, terror as coming from above, and perhaps terrorism is perhaps more likely to come from below. So there's another debate within the conceptualization of terrorism, is the extent that the state should be included or indeed not excluded from our understanding as to what terrorism means. Now, referring back to this idea that one person's terrorism is another's freedom fighter, I do think that it's very helpful not to have definitions or conceptualizations of terrorism that are perpetrated. And I want to coin Leonard Weinberg's very useful quote here. Hence, the notion of one man's terrorist as another man's freedom fighter is confusing the goal with the activity. And it is the activity of terrorism that we're interested in conceptualizing. It's the activity of terrorism. It's not what causes. So my view, Yasser Arafat was wrong when he said, well, we decide who the terrorist is by the cause that they fight for. If they're fighting for national liberation, they cannot be called a terrorist. Again, we're there. That's referring to the goal. What's interesting is conceptualizing the activity. So if you come up with your conception of what terrorism is, and let's say an act of violence takes place, and you look at the criteria that you've established, and it ticks the boxes for that criteria, and all your boxes are ticked for an act of terrorism, an act of terrorism it is, according to your conception of terrorism. The more that you are inclined to say it's not terrorism because, oh, actually, I might disagree with the cause there, so maybe I might want to change things around. Or if you disagree with the cause and it doesn't satisfy your criteria for terrorism, oh, I think that should be terrorism. The more you're swayed by the cause and the goal, the less analytical we're being about the activity of terrorism. So that's why I think it's really valuable to view terrorism method. Now, of course, there are ideologies and causes that you would argue might have terrorism and violence within them, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, for example. But these ideologies cannot take ownership of terrorism, because as we know, terrorism has been carried out as a method, but for a number of different causes, some of which, some ideologies of which are not necessarily violent, including nationalism, or animal rights, for example, isn't inherently a violent ideology. Anti-abortion isn't inherently an anti-violent ideology, a violent ideology. So the point really is, if we want to look at terrorism as a whole globally and actually see, well, actually, it's quite useful to view it as a method rather than try and define it according to who the perpetrator is. Very much willing to sort of discuss that further. Other related concepts, when you sit in conferences, well, actually, when we're looking, trying to understand the meaning of what is the difference between terrorism and war, because war is politically motivated violence. Now, you might then suggest, well, actually, it's a psychological dimension within terrorism. It's political violence with the intent to generate that psychological impact beyond the immediate victims for a political motive. And then the question might come back, well, what's the difference between that and psychological warfare? Because presumably psychological warfare is all about generating that psychological impact. And it's a fair question, although I think you probably suggest actually there are probably forms of psychological warfare that don't actually entail violence per se, but perhaps threats of violence. Again, a challenge there to try and draw that distinction perhaps between terrorism and psychological warfare. Guerrilla activity, I think it's fairly, and I know Bruce Hoffman does this in some of his work, where he draws this distinction between guerrilla warfare and terrorism, where guerrilla outfits tend to control the swathes of territory. They tend to have the ability to attack enemy forces in the open, and quite commonly have their own uniform. I mean, that has happened with terrorist outfits before, but commonly for guerrilla organizations tend to have their own uniforms. Other concepts, radicalization, and to reiterate earlier, words do matter. They do have real life implications. Now, radicalization is a concept that emerged that primarily referring to those who claim to be acting on behalf of Islam. And the term radicalization has been quite unfocused. I think in the UK, for example, it really wasn't that clear initially as to whether it referred to those people who were just on trajectories towards violence, or whether actually it was those people who believed in the ideology, for example, of the caliphate, but actually weren't in favor of the use of violence. It was quite unclear as to what the focus was. In terms of radicalization. The 2011 Prevent strategy in the United Kingdom then did provide some clarity on that. And it became clear, actually, that the focus was going to be not just on those who were clearly going down a trajectory towards violence, but also those who believed in the ideology behind it as well. In other words, what they termed non-extremist but non-violent ideology said to be conducive to terrorism. So in a sense, counterterrorism itself became increasingly engaged with the way people think, thought, and think ideologically, as well as what they do, in other words, in terms of violence. So the meanings of these words do have significant implications, for example, for the parameters of counterterrorism, what it's concerned with. Extremism, again, of course, is a concept, the sort of contemporary use. It's extremely nebulous, and I think it's probably defined in different ways in different countries, as indeed is terrorism as well, but very different to pin down. Often seen as deviation from society's norms, extremism, and but very broad and very difficult to pin down. And I've put cyber terrorism there as well, because I'm fairly skeptical about the concept of cyber terrorism, because it begs the question, well, what is it online that takes place that satisfies our definition of terrorism? Is cyber terrorism everything that terrorists do online? Or is cyber terrorism those perhaps relatively rare examples where there is the use of violence or the threat of violence to generate a psychological impact amongst the wider audience for a motive? And to what extent are there examples of that cyber world? But I think it's an important topic because it's important to make the distinctions between what is perhaps encouraging or a threatening violence online, and what may be ideological tracks to do with caliphate, but disagreeing with the use of violence, or perhaps some elements of Sharia law in this country, for example. And I think if you look at the contest strategy of the UK 2018, the recent ones come out in 2023, but the discussion on prevent and indeed the other three Ps, if you like, of that strategy in 2018 is much more comprehensive than this latest 2023 strategy. And time and again, it refers to terrorist online materials. It refers to terrorist propaganda, and doesn't actually say what is terrorist about propaganda, what is terrorist about materials. In other words, the distinction isn't drawn between, if you like, terrorist material that might be in favor of non-violent ideology, albeit seen as extremist by the UK government and others here. There isn't that distinction between that, the ideology, if you like, and those that would encourage violence. And that, I think, really helps to underpin quite a lot of the confusion there is when it comes to understanding what needs to be focused upon from a counter-terrorism perspective in the online world. Again, happy to discuss that. I thought I'd bring that, but generally fairly skeptical of this concept of terrorism. Alex Schmidt, he, I think, sent out, received something like 109 responses, I think, to a questionnaire, and from academics and policymakers and experts in the field some time ago, 1988 now. And he put together all these various components, and it's sort of really demonstrates this challenge as to what components you include in your conceptualization of terrorism. Now, of course, a definition like this is academic consensus definition. It's hardly going to be that useful to policymakers, of course, but it just does give you an idea of the challenge and how, if you like, how socially constructed it is. Everybody has a different idea of what terrorism is. Terrorism means different things to different people. Now, if we look at this conception, this is something I put together, but of course it stands there to be challenged. Terrorism is the use of violence or force, or the threat of violence or force, the primary purpose of generating a psychological impact beyond the immediate victims or object of attack, a political motive. But that would be my ultimate conceptualization of terrorism. Appreciate there can never be a concrete truth, and there are no right or wrong about that. But again, we're happy to discuss that. So I think it's fair to say that the meaning of terrorism is highly contested. It's been subjectively applied. It's very difficult in the real world to try and get some kind of analytical utility, if you like, within the concept of terrorism, the activity of terrorism that we're trying to determine the meaning of, when it is used so subjectively and applied so subjectively against your adversaries, to try and, if you like, win that propaganda war, to convince others that when you're using the word terrorism, if they accept that terrorism word as the right word to use, that you're winning that propaganda war against adversaries. And that's why it's often said that the nature of a definition often depends on who is doing the defining. That's sometimes when you review definitions, you get some idea as to who and where the person is coming from themselves when they're defining terrorism. To reiterate the components issue in terms of what elements do you include in your conceptualization of terrorism, which is of course very challenging. I would suggest, however, that it's really quite useful to establish whatever you believe terrorism to be, to establish a criteria in your components, and to, if you like, do a checklist so that if an act of terrorism takes place, or you believe it to be terrorism because it ticks all your criteria, then it's very useful to look at it as a method rather than to be swayed by the ideological causes or perpetrators. And that is why I said earlier that I thought Yasser Arafat was wrong when he said that whether someone's a terrorist or not depends whether they're fighting for national liberation or not. It is the activity that we are concerned with defining or conceptualizing here, not in whose cause it's being carried out. And finally, of course, the implications for the online environment. I think these conceptual discussions are very important in terms of the focus on online environment. What are the parameters of what you look at? Is it the way what people do, the way they behave, or is it the way they think ideologically? Is that the focus of counterterrorism? And then, of course, how do you then map that onto the online world? Or is it just that what terrorists do is the most important thing? So I will leave it there for that and be happy to discuss anything from that.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Very fascinating. My mind is kind of racing in regards to questions. Because again, this is one of those topics that is almost circular, right? You end up going back on yourself once you start thinking of a new thing. I am interested, it kind of ties on to your, I think, very practical approach of just focusing on method rather than group. Is I think most of them kind of posed this question before, but when do we consider, in your view, a group to be a terrorist group? Because we see Al Qaeda and stuff, even they see themselves as kind of an insurgent group who has done terrorist acts before, but they don't see themselves as that. Is it the case that once they've done it, we see them as a terrorist group and we should treat them as such? Or is it more practical to them they see are still a kind of insurgency group or a guerrilla group in another sense? And this kind of goes back to even now we have this big thorny issue with the Taliban, right? That we for years saw the Taliban as a terrorist group, but now they are the state in Afghanistan, right? So what do we do then? You know,
I think it's a very good question. It's a very good question. I think first, I suppose my first thought would be, and Martha Crenshaw made this point very. They're all within conflicts. There are many different modes of struggle. So if you're looking at an outfit like Al Qaeda, you know, the challenge there is to tease out, okay, what is terrorist about what they're doing? I think the mistake, for the sake of analytical clarity, would be to adjust your definition according to whatever Al Qaeda are doing. So, Al Qaeda had started. Let's see, they started, you know, hijacking ships, starting bank robberies or something. In other words, right, well, we should include that in our definition of terrorism. I think it's the other way around. You generate your definition of terrorism to what you're happy with. You know, this is what it means for me, and then you tick the box. Now, you know, instinctively in the policy making world, you can say, well, Al Qaeda did it, so it's terrorism. However, if we want to come away from it, so no, let's focus on the activity. And by the way, it's not exonerating outfits like Al Qaeda by saying it's not terrorism. It's not. It's just for the sake of analytical utility. So that you know. So what is it you say? When does a group become terrorist? Well, I think you look at the activity of the group, and if they're carrying out acts of violence that are intended to generate a psychological impact beyond the immediate victims for a political motive, and the threat thereof after that, and the credible threat thereof, I think you could fairly convincingly say, okay, that's a terrorist group. But it's a really good question, because there are other modes of activity that group might be involved with that you wouldn't necessarily put within that conceptual space. Your Taliban one's a really interesting one. I think, again, you're talking about civil war there, initially at least. He's talking about insurgency. You're talking about something that's probably of a greater scale than a terrorist outfit. However, and this is more the value, I think, of viewing terrorism as a method, that's not to say they didn't carry out the method of terrorism. In a similar way, you look at the revolutionary, well, perhaps not so similar, but the revolutionary arms of Colombia, FARC, or the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE, I think you could fairly confidently classify them as guerrilla organizations, but that they've used the method of terrorism. So I think when you look at these actors, whether they be guerrilla groups, extreme fringes of social movements, states, or out-and-out terrorist groups, and that might be quite a rarity, it's just a pure terrorist group, it's quite useful to view terrorism as a method. See, okay, let's satisfy the, so it's useful a method, rather than classifying all actors as a terrorist state, because even in those cases where states perhaps, you know, satisfy your definition of an act of terrorism, they've carried out an act of terrorism, of course, states have so many other dimensions. So to say it's simply it's a terrorist group might be problematic.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it lines up well with kind of, I think Schmidt had an article in 2004 where he looked at it from like different conceptualizations. Like, what if we look at terrorism as purely warfare, and what do we think about how we define it then versus politics versus communication versus as a religion or in linked with a religion, two different things there. I think, yeah, because with states, we can kind of see, I think in the political conceptualization, he discussed how, of course, states can do acts of terror, and we can see like we start off at the top where non-state actors do peaceful acts, and then they move towards terrorism. The state can also do that, right? So maybe this is the easiest way of doing it. One thing that I go back and forth on, and have my whole career has been this question you brought it up: is civilian targets, is civilian targeting essential to a definition, right? Because you can argue until you're blue in the face about this. The classic example I always cite is, I believe it happens, terribly a lot, but in Palestine, the like, you get attacks on Israeli soldiers by Hamas, and then that gets called terrorism. And then it's like, well, Hamas and the IDF, and like they see themselves as kind of a war with each other. So to us in the West, we call it terrorism because it looks like it, but is that really useful to just label it that when really they're attacking each other, right? They're almost two sub-states attacking each other. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, first up, I mean, how do you define civilians? It might seem fairly straightforward to define civilians, but, are civilians who take up arms in occupied territory, if you like, are they less civilian than other civilians? Are the civilians that were victims on 9/11 or Madrid or London, are they more civilian than maybe those civilians who are engaged in contracts in post-conflict environments and business contracts in those environments? So it's really challenging civilians. And then we move on to that conceptual debate as, okay, well, what about non-combatants? How do we define those? Now, I know the UN in the past has defined it as those people who are outside war zones or outside conflict zones. Therefore, they're non-combatants. Should they be seen as victims of terrorism? Fortunately, in my work, and I've argued this in some ways, is that I think anybody can be a victim of terrorism. I think even combatants can be a victim of terrorism if the objective, if it satisfies that definition of psychological impact and for a political motive. I think anybody can be a victim of terrorism. That would be my even combatants, if the object was. Yeah. So yeah.
I think that's definitely cleaner. I think like you said, I think it gets definitionally really hazy to kind of delineate between victims of a method, right? Because then it's like, what do you even call it then? How do you analyze it? What do you do? I think this gets to what you're getting about with cyber terrorism, because as someone who's involved in the field a lot, I think there's two competing definitions. There is kind of this kind of almost, I would call it, I mean, a bit dismissively, kind of Tom Clancy-esque idea of like terrorists hacking a nuclear sub, etc., or shutting down electric grids, stuff like that. And then there is simply terrorist use of the internet, which are two very different things, right? So we could say if terrorists could hijack a nuclear sub, yeah, I think you could call it that. But then that seems so unlikely, right? That is, they don't have the technological capabilities. So that one seems unlikely. On the other hand, terrorists use the internet, as I think Maura Conway has really put to rest, is like, of course they use the internet because they're people like us, right? So it becomes like, of course they're using the internet. How useful is for us to kind of examine it? But I was wondering your thoughts on that, especially because I do think we should examine it. I'm not saying throw away the field, but I'm obviously involved in the field.
Oh no, Sean, you've actually you put it absolutely brilliant. The idea that okay, terrorists. What is terrorism online? How does it satisfy our conception of terrorism? If there is stuff that's going on online which is intended to generate that psychological impact with violence or the threat of violence, then that does feel, for a political motive, that's within the conceptual space of terrorism. And you used examples that, if you penetrate air traffic control systems with the intention to bring down aircraft to shock the world, that would be within the conceptual space of terrorism. But as you quite rightly said, it's a whole different thing than to say, okay, how do you terrorists use the internet? Is that all cyber terrorism? But just because the guys we know who aim to be extremist or radicalized, we should be calling it cyber terrorism. I think that really does sort of make the world very murky in terms of conceptualizing what we mean by terrorism. But so therefore I question sometimes the validity of this sort of cyber terrorism term that's been used at times. I can see that there might be validity in it if it's used in the narrow way that I'm suggesting.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it also has a lot of. I think cyber terrorism is like the pertinent part of. You talked about definitions being used, especially by governments, to kind of label things they don't like, and cyber terrorism is one of the things I think pushing for this kind of online regulation of the internet, and like the Online Safety Act and like talks about it a lot without really defining what it is, and we end up in a situation where people's legitimate kind of human rights protected activity online is subject to kind of takedowns or I think because, well, we don't want to get in trouble with the regulator.
Yeah. I think there's a real need to determine from a policymaking perspective, with the help of companies, to determine the parameters of what line when it. I'm not sure that's.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's very tricky. I wanted to think of one last final question before I leave you. Can you kind of elucidate this kind of idea that you have about like the application of this method approach as opposed to this group approach? Like how would we use it going forward? Because what are the actual policy implications of saying if you use these set, maybe this is a way to agree upon it because we don't get into ideological territory, but if you use any of these set methods, you are a terrorist group. What are the kind of policy implications for that, do you think?
Yeah, and I suppose off the top of my head, I think one of the policy implications are that counterterrorism should be focused on what to do, not the way they think. And when you say method there, I think there's been a convergence in recent years in terms of the approach and response, in a convergence of extremism of method and extremism. And I think in that sense, I think counterterrorism has become more counter-ideological rather than focusing on the methods. And I think if you look at the definition of extremism, for example, again, there isn't this distinction between extremism and extremism. So, for example, if you, in a non-violent way, set up a stall with extremist material, but non-violently, that itself becomes an act of extremism. But in perhaps a very rare occurrence, but theoretically possible, you carried out an act of violence in favor of democracy somewhere, or feeling that you've been, for a human rights cause, let's say internationally, then that would actually escape the British definition of extremism. So if you carried out an extreme act for a good cause, if you like, that would escape the definition of extremism. But you could have a very non-extreme act, but for an extreme cause that falls within the definition of extremism. So there's this, I think, failure to draw that distinction between extremism of method and extremism of thought. And I think if we're in the business of countering terrorism, the way I've conceptualized it as a method of political violence, I think that should be the focus rather than broadening counterterrorism out to be more ideological in the way that people think as well as what they do. One of the problems doing that, you might have people who are absolutely opposed to the use of violence, adamantly opposed to violence, but who might have some sympathy with the idea of a caliphate or some non-violent ideology in a peaceful way, but find themselves within the terrorism space by virtue of the way that government has defined the problem. paradoxically, because we know that terrorism is about maybe people who are actually opposed to terrorism and violence will find themselves in the terrorism space by virtue of the way they think.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I do the idea in my head of this kind of like say someone committing a terrorist act for like EU integrationalism or like human rights protection or the like, um, which seems kind of obscure to us or kind of imaginary. But I think if we look historically, we've seen people who have done things, done violent acts which we might call as terrorism, political assassination, but like for what we would modernly call, contemporarily call good causes. And would we call them terrorists now? And I think maybe with the method approach we would, and at least we'd be a bit more consistent about it than relying on British values, as it were, to define it.
I think we can see examples historically where actually, again, if we're being analytical, and admittedly, if I take on this idea that combatants can be targets of terrorism too, there may be examples where you think, well, if it satisfies all my criteria, I might agree with the course, but actually it's still an act of terrorism. I'm not going to change the terrorism, this positive word, just because I'm trying to be analytical. So the French resistance might be an example. If it satisfies your criteria for what's terrorism, I'm not going to say, oh, the French resistance, I agreed with what they did. I better say freedom fighters, or I better find another positive label for it. No, it's still terrorism because we're trying to be analytically sound
Right.
here.
We're
And I
trying to
think
decouple it from the kind of moral position in regards.
yeah. And say, I mean, Kosovo Liberation Army might be an example of when it targeted Milosevic's forces and with the expressed desire to generate a psychological impact beyond immediate victims. Again, oh, actually, they're against Milosevic. I want to use the word terrorism. No, again, we're trying to be, again, enhance the analytical quality of terrorism. Not chop and change it according to what cause we agree, because it's the activity that we're interested in defining.
I think that's a very good point to leave it on. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I've had a great time discussing
Well,
this.
thank you very much, Sean. No, I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much indeed.
And I look forward to it's going to be quite early on in my semester. I'm going to be sharing this with my students, and I think they're going to love it as well. And hopefully, I'll get some good answers to our questions from them.
If there are any queries or questions come from it, do chat, direct them my way if it's helpful at all.
Oh, that'd be brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, well, thanks to the future audience, to my students, to the YouTube audience, whatever, for joining us. Thank you, Anthony, again. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll see you in the next lecture.
Thank you very much, Sean. Look forward to it. Thank you very much.